Thank you, Tim. I am delighted to be here. I have wanted to visit Australia ever since I saw The Sound of Music. And Tim, thank you. Thank you for a great, first of all, thank you, Australia, for that victory. That is a help to all elections around the world, teaching people how to take on statism that's been painted green and defeat it. And we're going to be taking an awful lot of time and effort in the United States to study how you did it, because we're going to run a campaign not unlike yours and hopefully as successful as yours. I want to talk about expanding the coalition that fights and works for liberty. I think this conference, Tim, was so helpful. That wonderful panel where there were 4 women who talked about their own personal movement from left to right and how that happened and what the costs were and what the words and the approach was that worked. Because we don't spend enough time working on that. Conservatives and libertarians used to sort of have a list of 20 things that you had to agree to be in our meeting or to be in our group. And if you only got 19 of the multiple choice questions right, you couldn't really be in and be part of the team. And that makes for smaller and smaller political movements that eventually extinguish. It was Ronald Reagan's vision, who understood there's not 20 questions, these are 20 portals. These are 20 different doors to come into the modern conservative, classical, liberal, libertarian movement. And we've actually put that into a structure for organizing in the United States and elsewhere, which is recognizing that our coalition, when you look at all the Republicans sitting around in a room in the United States, why is everybody there? And you think about it, and there's not, well, there is one answer when you get down to it, but it has many parts. Everybody's in that room because on their vote-moving issue, they want the same thing. They don't have the same vote-moving issue, but on their vote-moving issue, the issue that moves them, they share one thing. What they want is to be left alone by the government. And if you go around the table, taxpayers don't raise my taxes, people who want to educate their children at home, homeschooling in the United States, they just leave me alone. They don't go insist that you shower them with homeschooling stamps or tell them how swell they are or have parades in their honor. The Second Amendment community, people who want to keep firearms for their own use and for their own protection. Again, they don't insist that you buy books entitled Heather Has Two Hunters. They're not insisting that you become a hunter yourself. They just want to be left alone. Okay, done. End of conversation. Now we're happy. Go away. Businessmen and women, don't tax and regulate me out of existence. Self-employed people, don't unionize me. Don't sue me. Leave me alone to do what I want to do. The various communities of faith, people for whom their vote-moving issue, their central issue in their life, is to practice their faith, transmit it to their children, and be left alone. Okay? They may wish everybody was a Baptist, but that's not the option. The option is leave me alone. And so we have evangelical Protestants, conservative Catholics, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, Mormons, who do not agree who gets into heaven and how. But they all agree that if I'm to be left alone to get into heaven, all these other people who completely misunderstand Scripture and are going straight to Hades have to be allowed to do just that. And now we're happy. And so around the table, we actually have a room, a little bigger than this one, put 150 people every Wednesday for an hour and a half. 30 people present on what they're doing. And one of the ways to keep a movement forward-looking is you're only allowed to talk about what you're doing, not what your ridiculous hopes and aspirations are, not how mad you are that somebody in the 13th century put us on the wrong path, not what the president should do tomorrow. You know, if the president did this, it would happen. Yes, good. You got a plan to make that happen? We're listening. But your thought on what somebody else should do with their life is of not particular use in political organizing. And so when we built that meeting where you speak for 3 minutes max. You have more to say, write it down, put it in a handout. It's got to be about the future, no arguing with anybody else, nobody else, and the group doesn't do anything as a group. We don't all vote on something. We don't all agree on something. You're in, you share the part of the freedom movement that you're with. People learn from each other, both tactics, strategies, and ideas, and we work together. The only people who have to get it all is the candidate who stands in the middle of the room. And he or she has to say, I will leave your guns alone, your kids alone, your faith alone, your private school alone, your business alone, your money alone, your property alone. Done. I will leave you alone in the zone that you want to be left in most. Nobody in the room wants anything at the expense of anyone else on a vote-moving issue. Now, you can get into secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and whatever 5 is issues, and have all sorts of arguments. But vote-moving issues are the only ones that matter. One hook, one fish. You do not need to give somebody 7 reasons to vote for you. If you've spoken to their vote-moving issue, move along, get another voter as we move forward. We put together our meeting, frankly, by all the various meetings I'd ever been to, and there's a great story about the fellow who goes in to see a sculpture with a beautiful marble sculpture bust of Zeus. He said, "How in the world did you do that?" And the guy said, "Well, I took this big piece of marble and I removed all the bits that didn't look like Zeus." Zeus. How did we come up with how to structure a meeting that became forward-looking, positive, and so on? We just took all the bits that were destructive of previous meetings we'd all been going to for years and said, nobody talks for more than 3 minutes, nobody yells at anybody else, nobody tells you what their hopes are, they tell you what they're doing, what they're actually doing to move freedom forward. So around our center-right coalition, and I would argue that this has worked similarly, the meetings that we have in DC, there are now 41 states that have similar meetings in 26 different countries. Perth, Melbourne, and Sydney have all had meetings that are being restructured. Talked to Tim about how to work with them. New Zealand is organized, but there are meetings throughout Europe as well as Latin America and Asia. And once you get, and this was President Reagan's understanding, was that people were there because their interaction with the government was one that threatened them, one that bothered them, okay? They're not asking the government to go steal other people's money and give it to them. Some people do that. They bat for the other team. But our coalition is low maintenance as a result. The guy who wants to make money all day looks across the table at the guy who wants to go to church all day and says, "That's not how I spend my time." And they both look over at the guy who wants to fondle his guns all day and say, "Well, that's not how we spend our time." It's not necessary that everybody in the freedom movement agree what they do with their freedom. They just have to agree that everybody else should be left alone too, so that I can do what I want to do and you can do what you want to do, and nobody's asking the government to beat up on or steal from or push around or bully anybody else in the coalition. That's the center-right, leave us alone coalition. Now, I was asked, Hillary Clinton was running, you may remember Hillary Clinton from Arkansas and New York. She was running for Senate in New York in 2000, and the New York Reporter, she gave a speech and said, what progressives need, since they'd driven liberal into the ground and moved to progressive, what progressives need is one of those meetings like Grover Norquist runs in Washington, D.C., and the New York Reporter called and said, "What about that?" And I explained how our coalition works. I said, what would Hillary's table look like recently, since then stolen by Obama? Around the left's table in the United States, think about it in your own country, we have the trial lawyers who sue everybody and pay the Democrats lots of money, the big city political machines, the government workers, the unionized government workers, the union bosses of the government employees, government contractors who get rich selling things to the government, the 2 wings of the dependency movement, people who are locked into welfare dependency, people who make $100,000 a year managing their dependency, making sure none of them get jobs and become Republicans. And then we go to all of the various coercive utopians, okay? These are the people who invent the light bulbs that convince you have glaucoma. They mandate those toilets that don't flush completely. And on the Sabbath, you have to separate the green glass from the white glass from the brown glass for the recycling priests. And they have an entire list of things that you have to do because it makes them feel good because they're smarter and better than we are. And their list of what you have to do and what you're not allowed to do is slightly longer and more tedious than Leviticus. It just goes on and on and on. So around the left's table, they can get along as long as we are stupid enough to throw a bunch of money on a regular basis into the middle of the table. And then, like the scene after the bank robbery, right? One for you, one for you, one for you. They're all happy. But if we do our job and stop raising taxes and stop throwing money in the center of the table, then the paid customers on the Democratic side, the leadership that's only there because it's a living, they begin to look at each other a little bit more like the second to the last scene in those lifeboat movies. Now they're trying to decide who to push away from the table or who to eat. Because if we do not feed them taxpayers, they will cheerfully munch on the guy sitting next to them. Our job is to say no new taxes, mean it, keep it, stop funding the government, which funds much of the left in the United States, about 70%. And when come back in 2 and 4 years, when we have the next election, there'll be fewer of them and they'll be shorter. So our job, step one, stop raising taxes. That's what we're doing with the Taxpayer Protection Pledge. We've got 90% of the Republicans in the House and Senate who've taken that pledge, a lot of governors and state legislators. It's a written pledge to the people of the United States: I will never raise your taxes, no net tax increase. We did have a problem with George Herbert Walker Bush, who took that pledge, wouldn't have won the presidency, the nomination or the presidency without taking that pledge, did, but then he broke the pledge, and after an otherwise successful presidency, was thrown out of the White House because he lied. He said he wouldn't raise taxes, and he did. No one's life is a complete waste. Some people serve as bad examples. And from him, we learned, don't do that, okay? Take the pledge, keep the pledge, get elected, get reelected. And that's when we went to 90+% of the modern Republican Party taking the pledge to never raise taxes. In the 60 years before the pledge got that level of support, in those 60 years, the Democrats had control of the House and the Senate completely for 50 of the 60 years. There are only 2 years where the Republicans had a House, a Senate, and a president where they could have done anything as a party. 2 in 60 years. Since we took over, the Republicans have been in charge half the time. And more than not, in the House and the Senate, they've had Senate majorities and House majorities. It flipped the presumption about whether you were going to have a Republican Congress or a Democratic Congress with that one change that took place. They became the party that would not raise your taxes. They might invade small countries they can't pronounce, but they will not raise your taxes. And that's a pretty good starting point. Now, the pledge has branded the modern Republican Party that way, and branding is terribly important. That's what Coca-Cola spends a lot of time with, quality control, so every Coke is just like every other Coke, and they spend a lot of time advertising that. So you go to the store, you pick up a bottle of Coke, you take it home. You don't have to ask anybody, can I read the ingredients, or proprietor, could I have a taste of, you know what's in there, okay? You get home, and you're halfway through the bottle, and you discover there's a rat head in the bottle of your Coke. Coke has a problem, not with you, but with everybody that you show it to on social media, and it becomes a huge problem because they can't trust Coca-Cola anymore. It damages the brand, not just for you. You know, you don't go, I'm thinking I may not finish all the rest of this bottle of Coke tonight. You wonder whether you buy Coke again because of this. And as a result, it damages the brand for everyone. Republicans, elected officials who vote for tax increases are rat heads in a Coke bottle. They damage the brand for everyone else, and therefore it keeps them from doing it. It is a terribly important project. Now, there's the Leave Us Alone Coalition, the Taking Coalition. Our job as people advocating more and more liberty for more people and broader swaths is to figure out how to make more of us, more people who vote with the Leave Us Alone Coalition, and fewer with the Takings Coalition, people who view the proper role of government as taking things from other people and giving it to them. And that, when you make that list, we can actually change the nature of the electorate. You may remember Bertolt Brecht, the very left-wing, perhaps communist playwright, who in 1953, when the East Germans were having a revolt, which was a little embarrassing to have a workers' revolt in a workers' paradise, and somebody stuck a microphone in front of Bertolt Brecht and said, well, what's going on here? And it couldn't be the communist government's fault, so he pointed out, wisely, that what we need to do here is elect a new people. We can elect a new people. And by that, every time we expand liberty, we increase the number of people willing to fight for liberty. 30 years ago in the United States, homeschooling, educating your own kids at home, was a felony. Go to jail offense, okay? Truancy. We legalized it in all 50 states now, and the 2 million kids get homeschooled. They win all the spelling bees, and everybody realizes this is just fine. The teachers union want to shut it down. Homeschoolers have nowhere to go but the party that will stand for their right to homeschool. That's all they ask for. One party is run by the teachers union and wants to shut it down. In the United States, 30 years ago, only 6 states had shall issue concealed carry laws, where if you were 21 and an honest person and not crazy, you could carry a gun concealed. You had to be given the permit by the government for that. 41 states have that. Only 6 states had it 30 years ago. We now have 18 million Americans with concealed carry permits and one party that wants to take that away. So I made a decision to protect my family, my kids, my household, and one party says we're going to take that away from you. The other says, fine, you run your own life. Every time you expand liberty, you create more people willing to fight for it. Sometimes technology does that. There are 1 million drivers for Uber and Lyft. Again, 15 years ago, that didn't exist. 1 million people weren't self-employed people who had their own jobs and were independent contractors and decided when they would work and under what conditions they would work. And one party, Hillary Clinton, ran this last election in 2016 saying, my goal is to, quote, crack down on independent contractors. Their goal was to end independent contractors. You couldn't have Uber and Lyft in a world where everybody was an employee and working on an hourly basis and run along along those lines. As you move out and keep finding vaping, 11 years ago, there was no such thing as vaping. In the United States, there are 10 million people who vape. We've already elected a United States Senator solely on the vaping issue. Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. They organized every vape shop in the state. They worked it hard, and Ron Johnson, senator, got reelected. He was the one senator who wasn't going to get reelected. He was in a very difficult state. He's a lousy candidate. And there was every reason to believe he wasn't coming back. On election night, he said in front of the TV cameras, I was elected with the vaping vote. He knows that. People win and lose elections on that because people who've decided, I'm going to vape instead of smoke cigarettes, I'm going to help my life, I'm feeling good about it, people are, my kids are happy about it, I'm happy about it, and one party wants to have prohibition, and the other party says, we're going to leave you alone. These are the issues. As you create more freedom issues, we create more opportunities to bring people in. The second part is you can make fewer of them. Every time you don't raise taxes, you don't throw more money on the table, and they don't hire more government employees, the chances are that you have fewer Democratic precinct workers. And the wonderful polling data that shows if you have a government job for more than 10 years, it makes you 30% more likely to be a Democrat. Okay, so this is you get more government workers doing it. Now, if you work for this town pool for the summer, it will not ruin you or your children. Okay. But any protracted period of time, yes, it turns you more and more into a Democrat. If you have $5,000 or more shares of stock, like an IRA or a 401k, you don't have to have $1 million. $5,000 share of stock makes you 18% more Republican, less Democrat. Every demographic group that you have in the United States, white, black, old, young, rich, poor, government worker, non-government worker, becomes more Republican with $5,000 worth of share ownership. That's why the Republican Party's solution to every problem in the world is individual retirement accounts, personal retirement accounts, health accounts, education accounts. We want everybody to be in the stock market because it makes you more conscious of economic liberty, and you want the stock market to grow and the general economy to grow because you can see it yourself. As we look to have fewer of the other team, the other one is organized labor. In the United States, 7 million government workers, 7 million private sector workers, and we just got a law, Supreme Court decided, I guess not a law, that you cannot be required to pay union dues or join a union as a condition of employment for government workers. That's 7 million people, actually 5 million had that right before, but 5 million no longer have to pay union dues. And if what we found in other states happens, about 20% over time will pull out. It's $1 billion a year lost to the left simply by not forcing people to pay union dues. $1 billion every year. That's $4 billion missing in an election cycle. That's a lot of money for Soros to kick in if he's going to pick up the slack for that opportunity. So look for groups, individuals, structures that are damaged by state activity and befriend them. Look for ways to help them out. Find people who are locked into dependency who can be released from dependency or who are involuntarily funding the statist party, through union dues and other structures, and make it so that they don't have to do that. Again, the center-right coalitions that that have been organized both in D.C., around the United States, and around the country, I think give us an opportunity to consciously reach out to people and bring them in through one of 20 or 50 different open doors. There's a political movement in the United States, people who don't want to wear helmets on helmet laws. They want to become organ donors. But they wish to be left alone. And they're in. They're people who wish, whatever their issue is, they want to be left alone. We want to be there for them. They want to join the freedom movement. We want them there. We don't check people at the door and give them reasons not to become part of the freedom movement. Our job is to constantly be on the lookout for why other groups, new individuals, should be more interested in fighting for liberty and joining our team. And again, it's not a big entry fee. If you want to be left alone and you're willing to help us elect candidates who will leave other people alone so they can be free to run lives as they see fit, that's something to agree on, and it makes it possible for us to win increasingly more elections, state, federal, local level. Thank you so very much.
Okay, I think we have only a couple of minutes for some quick questions. The first question, I'm going to sort of combine several questions that were asked because they were all on a similar theme, which is you've addressed the tax side of the equation, but what about the spending side of the equation? Have Republicans stopped caring about spending and the deficit? And at what point will the national debt become a serious economic issue? Because really, isn't spending, isn't a deficit simply a deferred tax increase?
Okay. The Democrats want to focus on the deficit because there are two ways, theoretically, to stop the deficit. You could cut spending, which they're not interested in, or you could raise taxes. And if you say, I agree with you, the deficit is the problem, they will keep you at the table discussing tax increases until you turn blue. They will never get to spending restraint. If we want to do, and this is what I would argue, we do well when we do it correctly in the United States, our job is we want spending as a percentage of GDP as low as possible, okay? We want federal spending to be a smaller percentage of the entire economy in the future than in the past. There are only two ways to fix that. Spend less, okay? Or cut taxes, deregulate, take the trial lawyers, put them in plastic bags, float them down the river, all the things that give you more economic growth, okay? So more growth gives you a larger GDP, and less government gives you a smaller percentage of GDP. The two solutions to spending as a percentage of GDP are tax less, govern less, be less heavy-handed. But the Democrats can show up and insist that they have an equally good solution to the deficit. We'll raise taxes. And so the problem is spending. It's not the deficit. But if you lead with the deficit, they'll immediately jump and say, let's raise taxes. So let's look at spending and always focus on spending as a percentage of GDP. That's the problem. It's a huge problem. Here's what we'll do. If we have a Republican House Senate and we have more than a 3-vote majority in the Senate, we will block grant all the welfare programs in the United States. That's Medicaid, health care, it's welfare, it's food stamps, it's all of the stuff that you get because you're poor, not because you paid into it like Social Security or Medicare. Block grant them to states, as Clinton did, with aid to families with dependent children, welfare. They dropped spending about 30%. They got aid to the people who needed it, and the 50 states competed to do it better than other states. That's the biggest chunk. The other one is fixing the pension problems and moving completely to defined contribution plans rather than defined benefit plans, which a number of U.S. states have done.
I actually remember, I think one of my first weeks at ATR as an intern, doing a draft, I think it was a blog post or a media release or something, and I included the term $2 billion deficit, and it coming back with edits with deficit crossed out and $2 billion in overspending written, which I thought was a really, really good lesson that always sort of stuck with me as to how we think about these things.
Deficits imply the peasants have been lazy. What's the matter with you people? We have a deficit here. No. Overspend. The king is spending too much.
We have time for the final question and about 45 seconds to answer it. What's the success rate of the pledge in terms of politicians who sign it keeping it?
There is not a politician in office today at the federal level who has broken the pledge. They've all kept the pledge. There was one time when Bush broke the pledge in 1990, and he convinced some other people to break it with them. They're all dead or out of office. We have not had that problem again at the national level. At some states, we've had some challenges, but it is what is kept. When we succeed at the state level, we have enough guys taking the pledge that they can be the block against a tax increase. And if I could just leave with one question, and that is, when midgets play miniature golf, do they know? So.